What is going on, guys? All right, so part 2. Got the cylinder head back from the machine shop. We've already gone ahead and done our O-ring procedure. The way this works is we have a fixture, the BHJ fixture. Of course, it has to be resurfaced fresh, so it has to be completely straight. Put that fixture on, we bolt it down from the other side, and then we start chipping away. We make a 39 thousandths groove cut, and we cut it as deep as we want it, so we have the protrusion that we want. So a little bit of it is gonna stick out. I mean, it's very hard to see even with the naked eye unless you're looking at it from, you know, upside down. But anyway, we usually run about a couple thou protrusion. We use this with the Evo 9 head gasket, the 5-layer head gasket, which is 44 thou thick when it's crushed. Had fantastic results with this. This is exactly what we run on our personal, you know, shop car. My car has this, and we're making 970. That was on a warm day, so 4-digit power, and you know, we seal it up properly. Of course, you know, proper tuning goes a long way with, you know, any parts combination, but this certainly helps keep the head on the block and avoid flexing to the point that it lifts it enough that combustion pressure can go through the cooling system. All this is installed. Of course, we got GSC valves. Before we had Super Techs. Nothing wrong with those, but love using these super alloy exhaust valves. So if the customer decides to step on, you know, sit on the launch control for a while, it's not really going to be an issue. The cylinder head was previously ported, but not by us, so it's just a mild port. And as far as the valve springs go, well, the first thing I want to note is, notice how the stick out of the valve stem is a lot more than we had on the previous install. Now this has to be a certain amount, but you know, it can't be too high, can't be too low. But before it was just too low, and of course, you know, the nubs of the rocker arm were riding on this, and that's why we had that failure. And on top of that, these are the conical springs. It's a cone style, kind of looks like a beehive, but it's really not. It's a cone. These are 120 or 130 pounds of pressure on the intakes, I think, at the recommended install height, which is good for 50-60 pounds of boost. If you shim it, even more than that. Here's my handsome face, and there's Tony doing some other car stuff. Intake manifold install on Giovanni's car, and we're also upgrading the wastegate actuator. He has a 3071R Garrett ATP, and this has a bent wastegate on purpose. Like, this is how it comes from the manufacturer. I got in touch with ATP, and they overnighted me a unit. The last one they had in their inventory, that was a 22 psi. The one that we had here was a 10 psi, so we could barely get the car to make like 25-26 pounds on the 85, so didn't make the power he wanted. Also, we're putting a skunk 2 intake manifold on that car, and then we're gonna re-dyno it. I think we made 455 and 370, 380-ish torque last time around. This time he'll definitely be in the 5s. This is the car, Angel's car, beautifully built. Now we're just gonna put everything back together, show you guys how we're gonna, you know, when we put the Haltech in and the wiring of the sensors into the actual ECU, and just kind of go over some, you know, benefits of the Haltech and why we use that over other standalones. Of course, the customer support from my boys Anthony and Andrew from Haltech West is, you know, superb, and we've become a premium dealer this year, so very proud of that. Anyway, this episode is going to be basically putting the cylinder head on. Going to throw this thing on the dyno and see what we can make with an FP0 or 2 cams. It's going to be a good time. Cylinder head's on, exhaust side, all the rockers and the lifters are on. Just real quickly wanted to point something out. Since we had that failure on the exhaust side, or he had that failure on the exhaust side, you guys can see the nubs and the inside where it actually rides on the tip of the valve stem got chewed up pretty damn bad. So there are also a little bit of, you know, markings here, but you can't, it's nothing you can feel with your fingernail, so that's okay to go. You usually just want to spin the rollers to make sure the roller bearings are okay inside and there's no like grittiness or anything like that. So thankfully we didn't have any of that, but this is obviously going to be an issue. So there's 4 of them that are damaged. This one's not that bad, but since we're replacing them, we're going to replace all 4. And then these 2 are just left over. So this is just an example for you guys. Actually it's 6, it's not 4. There's 2 more somewhere else. But yeah, these are just things that you got to check over before you throw these back on. It's day 2. I had to leave yesterday and the GoPro battery died. Unfortunately, I didn't have it on charge. Got everything back together. Of course, new gaskets on the intake and exhaust side. Fairly easy to put the cylinder head back on an Evo. We did have to retime it, of course. Usually you can lock the cam gears and hold them up, but this time we were changing from the Gates belt to the OEM Evo 9 Kevlar reinforced belt, which is my favorite belt to use. He does have Kelford adjustable cams. Adjustable cams are okay as long as you make sure these are torqued to spec with a little bit of Loctite whenever you lock them in the final position. It also helps degree cams whenever you're assembling an engine. So if you do have some test springs and you're actually degreeing your engine with a degree wheel, it's an awesome thing to have. This is the only way that you're going to get to degree your cams. You need adjustable gears. Aside from everything else, there is still a little bit of work to do in the front. I just got to put the cover on and all that good stuff. Everything else is essentially all hooked up. I do have to put one of the coolant feed lines to the turbocharger on, fill up the cooling system. This has the filler neck on the actual thermostat housing, which is awesome. Whenever you get this STM billet radiator, which is like $1,000 piece, very nice piece, the billet and tanks, you have to move the bleed point somewhere else because this does not have a radiator cap. So the highest point would be here now. So this is where we're gonna bleed it from. I'll show you guys the bleeding procedure. I have a tool that you can bleed it. You can essentially create a vacuum in the system, and then once there's a full vacuum, you can just put a gallon of fresh coolant, green coolant for the Evo 8s and 9s, and then essentially have it cycle through and make sure there's no air bubbles. That's one way to do it. You just gotta make sure the pickup tube doesn't run dry, so you might have to stop it, put another bucket of coolant there or a gallon of coolant and then start again. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way where you put one of those filler necks here and then you pour coolant to the middle of it essentially, and then you warm up the car, turn on the heater so that it goes through the heater core circuit and warms up, and once the thermostat opens and water starts cycling through and you see it bubble, kind of grab the hose, squeeze it a little bit, make sure all the bubbles are out, and once it stops bubbling and you touch the coolant and it's warm, it means it's cycled through. There's no air pockets or anything. You cap that, you take it off, you put the radiator cap, you close it, done deal. One thing I wanted to talk about real quickly before I wrap the rest of it up and then start doing the Haltech stuff, spark plug. On this particular build, because he's going to be making over 700 horsepower, that's the goal. We did put S3s in this car as well. He had R2s. So it's a 2.2. And the R2s are great stroker cams, but he did want to make over 750, so I told him, hey, max effort, you need to go with the S3s to make that big power. We're going to be revving it to 85, 87-ish. I think last time we revved it to like 83-ish because it wasn't really making power past that. Spark plugs. This is a big topic that people often overlook, and they'll throw stock spark plugs in there. And, you know, it can work because the stock heat range plugs for the Evos, if you use the NGK stuff, you know, they're very rigid plugs, but of course you want to kind of follow that rule of thumb. My rule of thumb is if you're making over 500 horsepower, switch to a step colder plug. Same thing with the Evo 10s. So from the BPR 7 EIXs, radium plugs, we'll move to a BPR 8 EIX. And then my rule of thumb again is if you're making another 200 horsepower on top of that, so if you're making 700 and plus, move to a 2-step colder plug. Now we, instead of using the BPR 9 EIX, this is a BPR 7 EIX stock heat range Evo 8 plug, not 8, 9, 7, 8, or anything before 9 really. The Myvac head is different, and this is a BR 9 EIX. So notice there's no P in the part number, and that's because the actual electrode is not projected out. I like using these on big boost applications. You do have to drop the plug gap a little bit more, or just have very strong ignition system like the IGN 1A smart coils. The spark will still happen because there's a lot of boost in there and in the cylinder essentially, and you're not gonna have a problem lighting it off if you have the ignition system that can keep up with it. And I like the non-projected style on the really high power cars. Kind of helps with detonation stuff, and in my opinion, it has a better flame propagation. This is not backed by any data. This is just me doing it and just using these over the projected stuff on the higher power cars, and they tend to run a little bit better. You got to understand, especially because it's non-projected, you do have to, you know, keep in mind your ignition system has to be up to par with it. So we usually gap them to 14 thou. It depends on the system. So this has a R35 style coil and plug kit, still a 14 thou, kind of the safe spot. My theory with that is it's either gonna fire or it's not, you know, unless you have it at like 80 thou of gap, you're not gonna notice a, you know, difference in idle. You're definitely not going to notice anything in drivability. You will notice it if you have the wrong plug in there, so the wrong reach into the cylinder head and all that stuff. But as far as drivability goes, that gap is not going to make any difference. Anybody that tells you otherwise is just trying to sell you plugs. So with that being said, I already got them all torqued down, gap torqued down. Gonna put all the rest of the accessories on, and then we're going to follow up with the Haltech, and I'm going to show you guys some of the nice features with the Haltech. I'm going to install it and I'm going to talk about it, the wiring we use, how we pin it into the ECU, because this of course uses the stock wiring harness, and we're just pigtailing everything else into the ECU, which is very easy. It's not a daunting task, but I like to use really good material, so we use Raychem DR25 UK and US spec heat shrink. That's very easily, you can bend the wires, you can do whatever you want, and we use Tefsol wire, so the best wire there is on the market. So you get a nice thin pigtail essentially that runs through the firewall, and it looks super nice, and it's not bulky Harbor Freight style wires. So anyway, with that being said, car's running. There's a big exhaust leak. It's on the V-band flange, so it's the V-band that goes around the turbo outlet onto the downpipe. There's a big leak there, so I gotta fix it. That's why it sounds like this. You can literally feel it. It looked straight from when I was putting it on underneath, but it's obviously not. And then this is still in the stock ECU. Mind you guys, we did the S3, so it's not running perfectly right now, especially because of the fact that there's no narrowband O2 anymore. So we're gonna fix this as soon as we go on the Haltech, of course, but no more notorious lifter tick. Thank God for that. Angel's gonna be really happy. The motor sounds good. Finally, it doesn't sound like it has rod knock. It is annoying the crap out of me that it has an exhaust leak though. So I just bled the cooling system. This is pretty much ready to get cast now. So after this, I'm just gonna go over everything, start on the Haltech stuff, and then once the car cools down, I'm gonna get this clamp taken care of so we don't have an exhaust leak. Of course, you don't wanna go on the dyno with an exhaust leak, period, but specifically before your O2 sensor. So, but you don't want an exhaust leak, period. So we're gonna take care of that. So we'll see you guys once putting the Haltech stuff in. We are back with Angel's car. It is on the dyno officially. Started the car up, runs perfectly. There's no more ticking, so that's a blessing. Called the customer, he was super excited, and anytime the customer is excited, I'm excited. So we're ready to make some serious power. Like I said in the last video, we loaded it up with 24 pounds of spring. Running pump E85 on this, although E85 is a lot less prone to knock, it still can knock, so we are going to dial in the knock floors essentially, and then kind of walk the power up and make sure we're not rattling the engine. Aside from the Haltech, which let me show you guys real quickly, we do have our mount, but it's not completely mounted in yet. This makes a nice mounting solution, but basically this goes like this with a spacer and a bolt. And as you guys can see, it's behind the glove box, so the glove box, actually the backing of the glove box has to peel off. It's a super easy mounting solution, mounts everything beautifully. And then the bottom over here, all these wires, of course I'm gonna tie them up so they're not dangling and the passenger doesn't kick it, and all the sensors are not reading haywire. Aside from the actual plug and play kit, what you would need, what I recommend, and actually it's a requirement if you come to me for a calibration, is a WB1 wideband kit. Okay, now it could be the Bosch or the NTK. I prefer the NTK, that's what I have on my car, but the Bosch is perfectly fine. I ran that for a very long time. The Bosch sensors just kind of die a little bit faster than the NTK stuff, but of course the NTK stuff's about $200 more. Why we would use a CAN wideband or WB1 over, let's say, your AEM or your Innovate wired into the ECU is because, guys, the data itself is transferred via the CAN, and the CAN message is a lot more reliable. It's not going to be susceptible to voltage changes and voltage drops here and there. You're making sure that if your air fuel is reading 11.4 at wide open throttle, you're getting 11.4 exactly at the engine. So essentially it could have offset problems if you don't. So you could be at 12.5 and reading 11.4. Of course, we have ways of double checking that, like on the dyno. I have another air fuel sensor. This one's lab grade NTK, which is really expensive, a couple $100, but we can kind of verify what we're getting at the engine, even with the CAN wideband, and compared to the dyno one. Of course, that's at the tailpipe, so you kind of have to factor in the fact that by the time it comes out of the engine, goes through the whole exhaust system and out of the tailpipe, you're gonna get a slightly leaner reading. Usually we get about 0.2 AFR of a difference. From dyno to dyno and wideband to wideband, you're gonna get a little bit of different reading. Generally, you're gonna be about 0.2 AFR off from what you're seeing on the Haltech or any ECU for that matter. So CAN wideband is a must at Speedlab. And it's just, it's very critical data. Of course, you want to have that, and you want to make sure everything's, you're getting the air fuel that you're demanding. And of course, for closed loop data as well. So if you're driving around and it's making adjustments, because there's full-time closed loop on these standalone ECUs, that's one of the beauties of these ECUs. We can make sure at wide open throttle or cruising around, it's making the proper corrections and the car's not running all rough because, it thinks it's seeing a certain air fuel, but it's actually something completely off. Aside from that, we have a 5-bar map sensor. Although I do like to mount these off of the intake manifold, not hard mount them. Never had issues with those. That's a 5-bar Haltech stainless steel diaphragm map sensor. We have a fuel pressure sensor over there. Why that's important is fuel pressure differential across the injectors. If you're dropping fuel pressure, the pressure across the actual injectors drop as well. And if the ECU knows that and you have a table defining what pressure, how much dead time or how much latency the injector needs, you know, you could essentially drop fuel pressure on the track, God forbid, or on the road, or if you're doing, you know, you're going through turns and stuff like that, and the ECU will compensate. You won't even know what's going on. Of course, you know, you'll see it in the log when you look at it. You know, that's another beauty of the standalone ECU and having the right injector data. Of course, you can't just pull this out of your ass. You have to have the right data. But with the IDs, another reason why I love IDs and I swear by these injectors, works flawlessly. We always set it up. And of course, fuel pressure codes, fail safes if the fuel pressure drops to a certain point. And of course, we have an oil pressure sensor. So God forbid we're driving, you hit something on the road, you go over a curb or something, you hit your oil pan and you know, tear your oil pan apart, or your oil filter comes apart for whatever reason. We set minimum oil pressure limits in the ECU per RPM. So we'll say at 2000 RPM, you know, it needs to have a minimum of 30 PSI of oil pressure, which is very reasonable. It should actually make more than that. And if it's lower than that for whatever reason, I like to cut it off right there, and I like to shut the engine off. So I don't even give it any hysteresis. You know, it'll be 0.1 seconds or 0 seconds and it'll shut it off right away if it sees that. I'd rather do that than hurt the engine. That's another beauty of the standalone. So yes, guys, it's a fair amount of cost up front, but the money it's saving you, if it saves your engine one time, it paid for itself threefold already. So that's how I like you guys to, you know, or all my customers to look at a standalone investment. So even on a stock motor, it's worth it, because even if you're gonna build your motor later, if God forbid you're gonna have a failure, that motor is not gonna be good for a core anymore. So you're gonna, you know, save yourself some money by making sure you have those fail safes. Anyway, I'm gonna have Tony record me while I do this next step, and this next step is setting up the base timing with a timing light. So anytime you put a standalone on a car, or anytime you can set base timing, I suggest you do, especially when you have a built engine and a built cylinder head, meaning the cylinder head and the engine block have been resurfaced, because what you're doing is you're taking material off, so you're kind of closing the distance between the head and the block, and the cam sensor phasing and all that stuff is kind of changing. So you want to make sure that when you're requesting 15 degrees by 9,000 RPM, you are in fact getting 15 degrees at the engine. If you're off by 4 or 5 degrees and you're getting 20 degrees, you can blow your engine up, you can run into head lift, and of course all kinds of unwanted problems, detonation being the biggest one, especially if you're on a fuel like pump gas. So base timing is very, very important to set. We're gonna do that, and then we're gonna do some drivability stuff, and then we're gonna jump right into the wide open throttle stuff. Of course, after we do all the drivability stuff and making sure, you know, we get the most vacuum, any given RPM site, essentially driving around partial throttle. The way you do that is, you know, you kind of advance the ignition timing and until you get more and more vacuum and your vacuum stabilizes, then, you know, essentially you pull it back a little bit, and that would essentially be MBT. The mainline dyno actually has a function that I can plug a CAN wire from the ECU to the main line, and I can do MBT timing tuning. So that's gonna be something that I'm gonna do later on. I don't have the luxury of doing that now. That's something that's very badass, and you can kind of see at any given RPM point and any given load what MBT timing is gonna be. So that's pretty awesome. So we did O-ring it, and we do have conical springs. So we're ready for all the RPM, all the boost. It is a 2.2 liter, it is an FP0. I'm gonna say about 80 to 8,300 RPM is, as you know, it's gonna make peak power there. And after that, it's gonna fall off, so we don't need to rev it to 9,000 RPM. And it doesn't have the rod bolts for that, it has the ARP 2000s. Anyway, with that out of the way, I'm gonna have Tony record the process of me essentially setting the base timing. And then after that, like I said, it's gonna be some drivability stuff and then wide open throttle pulse. So see you guys in a minute. All right guys, so I gotta talk a little bit loud because the car is loud. So we have the timing locked at 0 degrees and we have the timing light. You guys probably won't be able to see it, but right now it's firing at the T mark on the crankshaft. I have to adjust about 4 degrees, so we're about 4 degrees too advanced. So you guys understand now why it's so critical to set this up before you start tuning and throwing power at the car. You can easily hurt stuff. The computer died again, but we got this just on time. So anyway, now we're just gonna do some drivability stuff, and then we'll get into some wastegate pulls, and you guys will be along for the ride. base gate. It's creeping to about 28 pounds of boost on the gate. But like I said, it's loaded for about 24 and a half, 25 pounds of gate. But it's creeping to like 28. Not a problem. Again, it's on the 85 only. So this is on the gate with conservative timing. I mean, conservative, you know, it's running like 8 degrees. Mind you, this is a 9-to-1 motor. Made 527, 411. So this is gonna make some stupid power by the time we're done with it. So looking over here, air fuel's where I want it to be. Of course, it's all open loop right now because I'm trying to make sure everything's good before I, you know, put it in closed loop. So it's around the 11.8, 11.9 mark that we want it to be. One thing to consider, guys, is even though it's on E85, it can still knock. So this is a rough table essentially that we put together as a threshold. So I tightened it up a little too much. You can see that initially right over here, it's taken out about 3 degrees of timing, which is what I have it take out immediately as soon as it sees knock. But everything else over here is fairly quiet. So I'm gonna retouch up this table. Again, this is very conservative timing, so it's most likely not knocking. But even though it's on E85, it can knock. It's just, you know, it's a different resonance essentially on E85 than it is on pump gas, just because you have so much more fuel in the cylinder. So that ringing sound that the knock actually makes is different than it would be on pump gas. But it can still knock, you can still have detonation on E85. It's just a lot less likely, of course, especially when you have a high ethanol blend, anything over E75. So with that being said, gonna touch a couple things up. I don't know if the second pump's working properly. I can activate the relay and it kicks on, but it seems like it's either not working under full boost, so it's not getting a reference to the hop switch, which I have to test right now, or simply the secondary pump is just on its way out. So depending on what I find, that's going to dictate what our next action is going to be. You know, we might have to throw another double pumper in there or replace one pump, or I don't know what's going to happen yet. But I don't see this car having any issues making 750 to mid 40s, low to mid 40s on this FP0. So stay tuned. So this is at 40, it's touching 46 pounds, tapers to about 43, 11.5 AFR flat, it's out of fuel. Unfortunately, the second pump is just not keeping up. I have both pumps kicking on at like 5 pounds of boost right now, and it's at 90% injector duty cycle, 86, 87%-ish at like 11.8 AFR. So I wouldn't really want to push it more than this. Although you could go up to like 95. The boost is really not making a difference, and the back pressure is kind of catching up to us, and that's why the boost's dropping. So there's a couple more degrees left in it. Of course, you don't want to hand the car back to the customer, you know, on the absolute ragged edge. So God forbid they drive it in hot weather, they get a bad batch of fuel or something like that. Obviously the knock control is there, but you don't want to solely rely on the fail safes that the ECU has. You kind of, as a tuner, want to, you know, make sure those things are kind of taken care of, and you know, you have a little bit of room left on the table without, you know, absolutely sending the vehicle. So maybe another couple degrees and maybe we'll see 740. Pull before this actually made 730, same torque. Knock control is not really doing anything while it's on boost. Over here we can see a little bit of activity right when the boost comes on actually. So we'll go ahead and take that degree out. 1 degree will take care of that. We are fairly soft on timing. I mean, it's at 14 degrees of timing up top, and this is a, like I said, it's a 9-to-1 motor. One more revision, one more pull, and then we'll turn all the closed loop stuff on and we should be good to go. Gave it another degree of timing, cleaned up the air fuel, and started implementing the closed loop boost control. That was 45 pounds flat all the way. As you guys can see, the horsepower, look at how flat that curve is. It literally held 736 from like 7,000 RPM all the way to the red line. I think we're gonna call it good here. I don't want to really, you know, push this thing too much. I'm happy with where it's at. That's a lot of power. It's making another 80 horsepower from what it was before, so, or something like that. So you're definitely gonna have a good time with this. And there's room to turn it up more later on. It just needs a bigger intake manifold, you know, some small stuff like that, and it'll be good to go. So I'll clean this up and then I'll just do a walk around with the car and then we'll end this video. So we called it at 7:36 and 5:55. As you guys saw, Tony was showing you guys the graph. Super nice flat graph all the way to 8400, and it's at 45 pounds flat. So very happy with the results. And there was a little bit more ignition timing left in it. Didn't want to, you know, be on that ragged edge of, you know, power. Like I said, you kind of always want to leave a little bit on the table there. Car was breaking up slightly towards the end. The last 2 pulls that I did, it was breaking up a little. It's because these plug gaps essentially. These are the GTR style. They never really work properly. I mean, they work, but they don't work any better than OEM, to be completely honest. Whenever you're trying to go for big power and you want to know for sure you're not going to have any issues with your spark, IGN-1As is the way to go, the smart coils. These are gapped to 14th thou. Also, I mean, it's a good idea to pull these in check. These, you can see kind of white-ish on these plugs, but that's not coolant or that's not them running lean. This is just the fact that it doesn't have enough miles on them. What you're looking for is whenever you actually look on the porcelain, you don't want to see any specking, which of course we dialed in the knob control. We know everything's fine and dandy. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna drop the gap from 14th thou to 10th thou, or even 12 would work, but again, it's either gonna fire or it's not. So we're gonna close down the gap, torque the plugs down. I have to dial in the rolling launch, but other than that, this car is ready to go. Some of you guys might be asking, why am I not just upping the dwell and the ECU? It's already at like 4.8 milliseconds of dwell, so anything more than that, these coils are going to start overheating and you can melt them. I don't want to do that, so what we're going to do is just gap down the plugs and this car is ready to go. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. There's a lot more of where this came from, so thank you guys for tuning in.